All right, welcome everybody. Let's do this. Let's continue our journey of trigonometry. What I'd like you to do is first copy this question down and the diagram. So here the question is saying, given cosine of theta is equal to 9 over 41, and that the angle theta terminates in quadrant 4, what is the value of sine of theta? So first, let's just go through each of these things step by step. What's the first thing we're given over here? We know that cosine of theta is 9 over 41. So let's just write cosine of theta is equal to 9 over 41. And what do we know about cosine of theta? That it is adjacent over hypotenuse, right? Okay. What's the second thing we're given over here? We know that the angle theta terminates in quadrant 4. So what does that mean? That if we have the initial ray, and this is quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4, before in your other questions you always terminated in quadrant 1. Now notice that the rotation over here is going to terminate in quadrant 4 somewhere, right? So the idea is we start over here, and then during some rotation we're going to finish over, let's say, here in quadrant 4. And notice that this is the initial ray, and this is the terminal ray over here. Okay? And we know that it finishes in quadrant 4, and we're going to call this theta. Right? So what's the idea that we could do over here? Let's draw our diagram, right? If we just draw our triangle over here, we know that this is theta. And now notice that we have cosine of theta. So what is, if I have our triangle like this, right? We know that the triangle looks like this. Right? This is your theta. Notice what's adjacent to your theta. It's going to be, let me get a different color. It'll be this side over here. This is adjacent to the theta. So we know that this is adjacent to the theta, right? And what's the measurement from here to here? This has to be 9, right? Okay, now what's the next thing we're given? We're given that the hypotenuse is 41. So what's the hypotenuse of this triangle? It's right over here, and this is, oops, let me use this color. This is 41, right? And this is the hypotenuse here, and let me show it like this, okay? And this is 41, okay? Now, what are we asked? We're asked that, what is the value of sine of theta? So notice that if you have 9 and 41, sine of theta is equal to what? It's equal to opposite over hypotenuse. So notice that we have the hypotenuse, which is 41. What are we missing? We're missing this opposite side. So what's the move that we could do? We want to find the third side. And then what are we going to use to find the third side? We're just going to use the Pythagorean Theorem that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? So notice that if you have your triangle just like this, remember the hypotenuse, like if this is the right angle over here, you know the hypotenuse is c, right? So we know that our c is 41, so this is 41 over here, and this is 9. So I'm sorry, this is your a and this is your b. So we know that the a is 9, so we have 9 squared plus some b squared equals 41 squared. And now we just need to find what the value of b is over here within this equation. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and try and find out what is b equal to. So going through this over here, what is 9 squared? This is 81 plus b squared equals 41 squared. I have no idea what 41 squared is, so let's just try it right here. 41 times 41 is 1,681. Okay, and then what's going to happen over here? We need to, how do we get b squared by itself? We're going to subtract, 81 on both sides. Okay, now we have b squared equals 1,600. And then what do we do once we get to this point over here? We're going to square root. So we know that b, what's the square root of 1,600? That's 40. So we know that the distance from here to here this is 40 over here, and this is 40. So this helps us with what is opposite of this theta. The measurement of here is 40. But once we get to this point, we have to put a timeout and a pause, because one thing that we haven't discussed in a while, you see, this is not the final answer just yet. Don't think that sine of theta is equal to 40 over 41. Just be patient for 1 second. Do you remember a long time ago where we talked about how when is sine positive, when is cosine positive, right? We know sine is positive in quadrant 1 and 2 because the sine, remember, let's just quick review. Remember, cosine talks about the x values, sine talks about the y values. So the idea is, notice in quadrant 1 and 2, sine is positive because the y values are positive above the x-axis. When is sine negative? Sine is negative below the x-axis. So notice that sine is negative in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. When is cosine positive? Remember, cosine is the x value, so it's in this to the right side. So in quadrant 1 and 4, cosine is positive. Here, cosine is negative. So to fully answer this question, it's saying sine of theta is equal to 40 over 41. But where is your theta? Notice your theta is in quadrant 4. So notice over here, you see how when it said cosine of theta is 9 over 41, is cosine positive in quadrant 4? Yes. But what about sine? Is sine positive or negative in quadrant 4? Sine is negative in quadrant 4. So the full answer, sine of theta, is equal to negative 40 over 41. Okay? You have to be a little bit careful towards the end. When you get to the final part, you need to ask yourself, is it positive or negative? And you should have this as a reference guide. Okay? Okie dokie. Let's try one more. Let me the question, and let's look at this. Now here, what I'd like you to do is, given what we did in the previous example, try and do this question on your own. Okay? Let's read it together. It says, given that sine of theta is equal to negative 60 over 61. So even without even continuing, you know that sine is negative. Where will sine have to be, right? It's going to have to be in quadrant 3 or 4, right? Because we know sine is negative below the x-axis, right? Like if it said it's quadrant 1 or 2, then this has to be positive. So it says, let me fix the camera angle. It says, given that the sine of theta is negative 60 over 61 and that the angle terminates in quadrant 3, what is the value of tangent theta? So let's take our time. We know that sine of theta is negative 60 over 61. So let's see. Sine of theta is equal to negative 60 over 61. So we know that this is, what's sine of theta? It's opposite over hypotenuse. So if we were to draw this rotation out, notice that this is the initial ray, and where does it end? It ends somewhere in quadrant 3. Okay? So now we're in quadrant 3, and we know that this is our theta over here, and we're going to make our little triangle over here. So notice that within this triangle, let me draw the triangle like this. Okay. This is the right angle. Okay, and this is our theta. Notice what is opposite of the theta, it will have to be this side over here. So we know that this is 60. It's not, we're not going to say it's negative 60 because remember the distance can't be negative. So this is 60. What's the hypotenuse of this triangle? It's here, right? So this is 61. Now, what's the question asking? The question's asking what's tangent theta. So we know that tangent theta is equal to, what I want you to do is pause the video and what is tangent theta equal to, right? It's opposite over adjacent. So now notice that we have the opposite, which is 60. What is the adjacent? We don't know the adjacent. So we need to find this side over here. So how would we actually do this? We need to use the Pythagorean theorem of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? So if I have my triangle over here like this, what is your A, B, and C? Remember that this is the C, this is A and B. So we know that we have the C. So we know C is 61. So it's 61 squared. We have one of the legs, so it's 60 squared plus B squared. So we need to find this adjacent side. So let's actually, what I want you to do is pause the video and try and find B. Okay. Let me fix the camera angle. Okay. Now here, let's see, what's 60 squared? This is 3,600 plus B squared equals 61 squared. I don't know. So let's see, 61 times 61 is 3,721. So 3,721. Okay. Now what do we need to do? We need to subtract 3,600 on both sides. So now we have B squared equals, what is this, 121. And then what do we do from this position? We square root. And now we have B is equal to 11, okay? Because the square root of 121 is 11. So now going back to this problem, we know that this adjacent side of the theta is 11. So we have tangent theta is equal to 60 over 11 over here. But then we're not done yet, because we have to ask ourselves, is tangent theta over here in quadrant 3, is this positive or negative? And how do we know? So notice that we talked about sine being positive and sine and cosine of positive, negative, but we never talked about tangent. So this will take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to fully explain it. But like if we have this scenario over here, we know sine is positive over here. Sine is negative in quadrant 3 and 4. Cosine is positive here. And cosine is negative here. Okay? Then the next question we have is, well, what about tangent? How do we know if tangent is positive or negative here and for the other quadrants as well? So we have to I have to show you a little bit of magic. So you got to be a little bit patient, okay? Because this will take me a few minutes to explain. So what I want you to do is, let's just take a look at this for a second and be patient, like I will fully explain this. Here, we've known this before, right? We know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and we know that tangent is opposite over adjacent, okay? So I'm gonna have a little claim. I'm going to say that tangent theta is equal to sine of theta over cosine theta. And I'm going to prove this to you. Okay, so what's the proof? So we know, let's take a look here. And what I want you to do is go through the proof with me. What is tangent theta equal to? Tangent theta is opposite over adjacent, right? What's sine of theta equal to? Sine of theta, notice, is, let's just do this. What is sine of theta? We have this over here. Sine of theta is opposite over hypotenuse. And what's cosine of theta? Cosine of theta is adjacent over hypotenuse. So notice that we have this little fraction over here. We have a fraction divided by another fraction. So how do we actually continue this forward? Here, how do you divide fractions? Okay, so divide fractions. Notice we have to do keep, change, flip. So if we have this fraction over here of opposite over hypotenuse divided by adjacent over hypotenuse, notice how do you actually do this? Well, we keep this, so we keep the opposite over hypotenuse. We're going to change this to multiplication, and then what are we going to do with the adjacent and the hypotenuse? We're going to flip it. So notice that the hypotenuse goes on top and the adjacent goes on the bottom. So notice what happens over here when you actually multiply this. The hypotenuses cancel. because you have a hypotenuse on the top and hypotenuse on the bottom. So what are you left with? You're left with opposite over adjacent. So I just showed that, notice that we started with sine of theta over cosine theta. Notice that when we did the actual math for it, we finished with opposite over adjacent. But what is opposite over adjacent? Opposite over adjacent is tangent theta. So then this will have to be true, that tangent theta is equal to sine theta over cosine theta. So how does this actually help us determine whether or not, like, when is sine positive and when is when is tangent positive or negative? Notice that this has to be true, that tangent theta, and I'll write it over here, tangent theta is equal to sine of theta over cosine theta. Now, why does this help us? Notice here, let me fix this a little bit. Okay, we're almost done. Notice tangent theta is sine of theta over cosine theta. So here, hey, what's a positive? Notice, look, sine of theta over cosine theta. What is a positive divided by a positive? Positive. So then tangent theta has to be positive in quadrant 1. What about here? What's a positive divided by a negative? It's negative. So tangent is negative in quadrant 2. What about over here? What is negative divided by a negative? Here, negative divided by a negative is positive. And what about this example here? What is negative divided by positive? This is negative. So notice that tangent is positive in quadrants 1 and 3, and tangent is negative in quadrants 2 and 4. So to finally go back to this question, it's saying this tangent theta, notice that it's in quadrant 3, right? We had tangent in quadrant 3, so this tangent theta is going to be negative. So it's a negative 60 over 11, okay? If you felt like you didn't fully understand how I got tangent theta to be how this proof worked, I would say we could go over it in class together, but just accept it, right? It is what it is. Tangent theta is sine of theta over cosine theta, okay? And in the next lesson, well, we talked about, sine, cosine, tangent. What about secant theta? What about cosecant theta? What about cotangent theta? When will these angles, secant theta will be positive where? Negative where? Cosecant, positive where? Negative where? And we'll do that in the next video. Okay? What I'd like you to do is try and work on some of the delta math questions, and you got this. I'll see you in the Google Hangouts.